The sterile whir of the air filtration system was a constant, unnerving companion. It hummed beneath my skin, a low, thrumming vibration that promised purification but delivered only a dull ache behind my eyes. I hated these calls, especially to places like this, a quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The phrase alone was enough to make my shoulders tense. Every breath through the respirator felt recycled, tasting faintly of plastic and my own anxiety. I'd been summoned, of course. My name, Blake, was synonymous with the cases no one else could crack, the ones that twisted the rules of logic into Gordian knots. A reputation I'd built meticulously, brick by painstaking brick, each one cemented with a detached precision I cultivated like a rare orchid. Emotions were a liability in my line of work, and I'd long since learned to prune them back, keeping only the sharp, analytical edge. The journey through the facility was a succession of airlocks and decontamination showers. Each door hissed open, then sealed with a pneumatic sigh, isolating us further from the outside world. The walls were stark white, the floors an unforgiving linoleum, reflecting the harsh LED lighting without warmth. My colleague, the lead investigator, walked ahead, his movements heavy in the full hazmat suit. The bulky protective gear made everyone look identical, faceless astronauts on a grim mission. I preferred it that way. It stripped away the superficial, leaving only the problem to be solved. "Blake, I ready for this." The lead investigator's voice crackled through my comms unit, tinny and distant. As I'll ever be, I replied, my own voice sounding alien to my ears. My gloved hands automatically checked the seals on my suit for the 10th time. It wasn't the pathogen that worried me. I trusted the gear. It was the unknown, the unpredictable variable, the kind that threw meticulously gathered data into disarray. We reached the inner chamber, a large, rectangular room that seemed to serve as a makeshift common area. A table and a few chairs were overturned, but not violently so, more like they'd been nudged. My eyes, narrowed behind the visor, immediately began their sweep, cataloging. The victim lay slumped against one wall, a man in a rumpled uniform, his face slack and gray, no visible wounds from this distance. My first thought, before I even processed the details, was how still he was, too still. Not the contorted stillness of sudden, agonizing death, but a composed stillness, almost serene. My internal alarm bells, usually a faint chime, suddenly rang with a discordant clang. Cause of death appears to be a single gunshot wound to the chest, the lead investigator reported, gesturing vaguely with a gloved hand. Small caliber. The weapon is still here, clutched in his hand. I took a step closer, my heavy boots thudding softly on the linoleum. The scene was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, a stark contrast to the bleached environment. My gaze went straight to the victim's hand. A small, silver handgun nestled perfectly in his palm. His index finger was hooked through the trigger guard, but not actually on the trigger. It was a subtle distinction, one that would be missed by a less obsessive eye. "Suicide, then." A junior officer's voice crackled. "That's what it looks like," the lead investigator confirmed, his tone already leaning towards conclusion. I said nothing, my mind already racing through possibilities. Suicide, the most straightforward explanation. And yet everything felt too neat. I circled the body slowly, my head swiveling, taking in every detail. The weapon, clean, no smudges on the grip. Not even a faint transfer of skin oils, which would be expected even from a gloved hand. The victim's position, slumped, yes, but almost artfully so. His head rested against the wall, eyes half closed, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It was the kind of expression one might arrange for a photograph, not the grimace of a man blowing a hole through his own chest. There was a single shell casing, glinting innocently on the floor beside his left knee. Singular, and placed with almost deliberate care, not having bounced or skittered. No blood spatter on the wall behind him, only a small dark stain spreading on his uniform over his heart. The entry wound was clean, precise. The kind of shot a professional would make, or a very determined amateur who had practiced. My eyes drifted to the table, overturned. But the objects on it, a half-empty mug, a notepad, a pen, were scattered, yes, but not flung. They seemed to have fallen, rather than been swiped away in a struggle. The pen lay neatly beside the notepad, not underneath it. "Blake, I seeing something?" the lead investigator asked, picking up on my prolonged silence. "I'm seeing everything," I muttered, more to myself than to him, "and that's the problem." I knelt, ignoring the slight strain on my suit. The victim's shoes were still tied, laces neat. His pockets slightly bulging as if they contained keys and a wallet undisturbed. And then I saw it. Tucked beneath his left hand, almost hidden by the sleeve of his uniform, was a folded piece of paper, a note. "There's a note," I announced, my voice flat, carefully positioned. The lead investigator sighed. "See, it's a suicide." The man was likely feeling the pressure of this containment, the isolation. "It happens." I extracted the note with gloved fingers, holding it carefully. It was a single sheet, folded crisply, the edges uncreased from being crumpled or hastily shoved. The handwriting was neat, almost calligraphic. It read, "I can't take it anymore, forgive me." It was a perfectly generic suicide note, almost too perfect. No specific grievances, no personal touches, no frantic scribbles, just the bare minimum. I stood, turning the note over in my hand. My mind worked through the scenario. A man driven to despair shoots himself. The gun drops. The body slumps. The shell casing ejects, bounces. The note, if written in the throes of anguish, would be crumpled, perhaps hastily scrawled. But this was a tableau. Every element seemed to scream suicide in bold, capital letters, leaving no room for doubt. And that right there was the doubt. A real suicide scene born of desperation and chaos was rarely this tidy, this unambiguous. The human element, the raw emotion, always left its messy fingerprints. I looked at the lead investigator, whose expression, even through the visor, conveyed a weary acceptance. He wanted this to be simple. A very good one, but a performance nonetheless. The lead investigator shifted, a rustle of his suit. "I think someone staged this. I think someone wants us to think this man took his own life." I clarified, my gaze sweeping the room again, searching for the imperfection, the one misplaced pixel in this meticulously crafted picture. This wasn't just a killer. This was a craftsman, a storyteller, and I was about to dissect his narrative. The game, I realized, had just begun, and I had a feeling it was going to be anything but clean. The air in the designated clean room of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, hummed with the low thrum of filtration systems. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment, all gleaming steel and stark white walls, designed to contain the unseen. But today it was containing the aftermath of a very visible, very brutal act. My earlier prickle of unease had solidified into a cold, hard knot in my gut. This wasn't just a killer. This was a performance. I stood before the large, stainless steel examination table where the victim lay, now shrouded in a pristine white sheet. The crime scene photographs, laid out meticulously on a nearby light table, were my window back into that carefully constructed tableau. My colleagues, a small team of specialized forensic technicians, moved with practiced efficiency, preparing their tools in the adjoining prep room, their movements muffled by the thick glass. "All right, team," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum, amplified slightly by the room's acoustics. "Standard procedure, but with a twist. Assume everything is a lie until proven otherwise. Every placement, every drop, every fiber. We're dissecting a narrative, not just a body." A junior colleague, new to my specific brand of obsessive scrutiny, nodded a little too vigorously. The lead technician, a seasoned veteran named Marcus, merely grunted, already pulling on his second pair of gloves. He knew what I meant. He'd seen enough perfect scenes to know they were usually anything but. My eyes scanned the photographs again. The victim, the knife, the single, artfully placed flower. It was all so deliberate, too deliberate. It reminded me of a stage director meticulously arranging props for a play. And I was the critic, tasked with pulling back the curtain. "Let's start with the surface trace evidence," I instructed, pulling on my own set of triple-layered gloves. "Vacuum the clothing first, then move to tape lifts. Pay particular attention to the victim's hands and anything trapped beneath the fingernails. I want every single particle documented, bagged, and labeled with extreme prejudice. The first few hours were a monotonous ballet of precision. My colleagues, working under my watchful eye, methodically processed the victim's clothing. Each garment was meticulously examined under polarized light, then carefully vacuumed, the contents of the filter cartridges destined for the scanning electron microscope. Then came the tape lifts, a painstaking process of pressing adhesive tape across every inch of fabric, capturing fibers, hairs, and microscopic dust. "Blake, I've got something here," Marcus called out, his voice a low rumble. He was hunched over the victim's left hand, now extended from beneath the sheet. With a pair of tweezers, he carefully extracted a short, dark fiber from beneath a fingernail. It was barely visible to the naked eye, a tiny speck against the pale skin. I leaned in, peering through the magnification lens he offered. "Bag it. Note the exact location and depth. Any other abnormalities around the digits?" Marcus shook his head. "Clean as a whistle otherwise. No defensive wounds, no struggle marks, just this one little guy. Clean as a whistle." That phrase echoed in my mind. No defensive wounds was consistent with the perfect scene, a swift, decisive strike, but the fiber. It was the first crack. "Let's get that fiber to the microscopy lab immediately," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I want preliminary results on that before anything else." While Marcus dispatched the sample, I turned my attention to the victim's clothing. The jacket, a heavy wool blend, was remarkably free of foreign fibers. Too free. Most people, even those meticulous about cleanliness, pick up something from their environment: a pet hair, a couch fiber, dust from their car seat. This jacket was almost pristine. Odd, isn't it? I mused aloud, more to myself than to the junior colleague carefully bagging a pair of shoes, almost as if it was freshly laundered, worn for a very short period in a controlled environment. The colleague paused, looking up. "You think the killer changed their clothes, Blake?" "No," I corrected. "I think the victim's clothes are telling a story that doesn't quite fit. The scene suggested an encounter, perhaps a struggle, however brief. Yet the jacket is remarkably clean." My internal monologue was already running through possibilities. Had the victim been abducted, changed, then brought to the scene? Or had the killer painstakingly cleaned the victim after the fact? Both scenarios added layers of complexity that the initial open and shut presentation completely ignored. Later, as the preliminary report on the fiber came back, my suspicions intensified. It was synthetic, a specific polymer often used in specialized industrial cleaning cloths, the kind I might find in a sterile environment. A cleaning cloth. Marcus raised an eyebrow, reviewing the report on his tablet. "So our killer was tidying up, or was wearing something made of it," I countered, tapping my finger on the gleaming steel table. "But if they were cleaning, why leave that one tiny fiber? It's almost too small to notice, but specific enough to identify." It felt like a deliberate breadcrumb placed not for its obviousness but for its subtlety, a clue designed to be found, but only if I was looking beyond the surface. Then came the second discrepancy, this one from the blood spatter analysis. The initial photographs showed a clean, almost artistic pattern of arterial spray consistent with the single, deep wound. But as my team carefully mapped and analyzed the trajectory and droplet size, a pattern began to emerge that didn't quite fit. "Blake, the angles here. They are inconsistent," another colleague, Sarah, reported, pointing to a diagram on a digital display. "Some of the smaller droplets suggest a secondary impact, a movement that doesn't align with the primary arterial spray. It's like the victim was moved slightly or something else was impacted, causing a secondary spatter event that was then cleaned up almost entirely." My eyes narrowed. Cleaned up. There it was again. The killer was meticulous but not perfect. They had left behind just enough of a trace to hint at something more. So the victim was stabbed, then perhaps moved. Something was hit, causing a different spatter pattern. Then that was almost entirely wiped away. I summarized, piecing the fragments together. except for these few, almost imperceptible droplets. The perfect scene was beginning to fray at the edges. The meticulously placed knife, the single flower, the lack of defensive wounds, it was all a carefully constructed facade. But the industrial fiber and the anomalous blood spatter were tiny tears in that fabric, revealing a more complex, messier truth beneath. The game, as I'd suspected, was anything but clean. And it was becoming clear that the killer wasn't just a craftsman. They were a master manipulator trying to lead us down a very specific path. And I, for one, refused to follow blindly. The real investigation, I realized, had just truly begun. The sterile hum of the lab was a familiar drone, a constant companion to my thoughts as I leaned into the oculars of the comparison microscope. The world beyond the lenses blurred, only the field of view mattered. On one slide, the single, synthetic filament I'd painstakingly retrieved from the victim's sleeve. On the other, a reference sample from our industrial fiber database. They were similar, but not identical. My gut clenched. That perfect scene, it had been too neat, too pristine, like a stage set after the final curtain. The industrial fiber and that odd blood spatter were the only dropped props. I adjusted the focus, bringing the fiber into sharper relief. It was a peculiar thing, no thicker than a spider's silk, yet unnaturally stiff, almost metallic in its sheen. The database had flagged it as a high-performance polymer, common in heavy machinery, but this specific variant. It had a unique crystalline structure, visible only under extreme magnification. It wasn't just any industrial fiber. It was specialized. My mind replayed the crime scene, the victim serene, almost posed, the knife impossibly clean, the single perfect flower. No struggle, no defensive wounds. Everything screamed staged. And then the blood spatter. I swiveled my chair to the adjacent workstation, where a series of high-resolution images of the spatter patterns were displayed. My initial analysis had noted an anomaly, a subtle inconsistency. Now I needed to dig deeper. The primary spatter emanating from the chest wound was exactly what I'd expect from a single, forceful stab. But overlaying it almost imperceptibly was a faint, wider dispersion pattern. It was like two separate events had occurred, one on top of the other, but meticulously clean to leave only a ghost of the second. Luminol had shown faint traces of a larger, wider splash zone, meticulously wiped away, but enough residual protein remained to confirm it. I frowned, tracing the phantom lines on the screen with a gloved finger. If the victim had been stabbed there, in that immaculate living room, the primary spatter should have been consistent and singular. This secondary pattern, it suggested movement or perhaps an attempt to contain a larger mess before the body was placed, but why? A tap on the door frame startled me. The detective stood there, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over my cluttered workstations. Anything, Blake. The chief is breathing down my neck. This one's got everyone stumped. I pushed away from the microscope, peeling off my gloves. Possibly. The industrial fiber. It's not a standard construction material. This specific polymer is used in high-efficiency filtration systems. The kind you find in environments needing extremely clean air. Think biocontainment, sterile manufacturing, places where you can't have a single particle out of place. The detective raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism playing on his features. So, our killer works in a clean room. That's quite a leap from a single fiber. It's not just a clean room, I countered, my voice tight with conviction. This specific polymer with this crystalline structure is proprietary. I'm cross-referencing it now, but it's pointing towards a very niche application. Systems designed to filter out airborne pathogens, to prevent contamination in or out of a facility. My eyes met his. Like the kind of ventilation system you'd find in a quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. His posture stiffened. The mention of that place always brought a chill. It was a new facility, built on the outskirts of the city, shrouded in secrecy and whispers of dangerous research. Nobody wanted to talk about it. You think the fiber came from there? He asked, his voice lower now. Why would anyone from a place like that be involved in a domestic murder? I don't know why yet, I admitted, turning back to the blood spatter images. But there's more. The blood spatter analysis is problematic. The primary impact pattern is consistent with the wound. But there's a fainter secondary pattern meticulously cleaned that suggests a much larger initial spatter event, or, at the very least, that the victim was moved after the initial injury, but before being placed in that perfect position. The detective stepped closer, peering at the screen. Moved? You're saying the stabbing didn't happen in that living room? Not entirely, I clarified. Or if it did, there was a significant cleanup and the body was then repositioned. The spatter patterns aren't just inconsistent, they are contradictory. It's like someone tried to tell a story with the blood, but messed up a crucial detail. The primary pattern implies a quick, clean kill. The killer wasn't just staging the scene to look like a simple domestic dispute. They were staging it to mislead. The pristine nature of the scene wasn't just about making it look like an easy case. It was about covering up a more violent, complex reality. The single flower, the unblemished knife, they were carefully chosen props to distract from the real narrative. Wait, I murmured, my thoughts racing. That doesn't add up. If the killer wanted to make it look clean, why leave any trace of a secondary spatter? Why not clean it all perfectly? Unless they wanted us to find just enough to make us think it was simple, but not enough to reveal the true depth of the deception. I spun back to the microscope, my gaze fixed on the peculiar fiber. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't sloppy work. This was deliberate. The fiber, the anomalous spatter, they weren't errors. They were planted, not to frame someone, but to send us down a specific false path, to make us believe in a narrative that wasn't true while subtly hinting at something more. The detective was quiet for a long moment, absorbing my words. So, I think the killer is trying to play games with us. I think the killer is trying to control the narrative. I corrected, a determined edge in my voice. The who might be obscured by the how and the why, the deception. This isn't about a crime of passion. This is about calculation, and that fiber, it's our first real thread. A very specific, very rare thread leading to a very specific, very restricted facility. A flicker of doubt, brief and unsettling, crossed my mind. Was I overthinking it? Was I seeing patterns where there were none, simply because the scene felt off? The unique fiber, the contradictory blood patterns. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a deliberate paradox. My focus sharpened, the tension in the room palpable. The investigation had just twisted into something far more intricate, a labyrinth of smoke and mirrors. And at its heart, a killer who wasn't just hiding but actively guiding us astray. My gaze drifted back to the monitor, where the coordinates of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, now glowed faintly on the screen. This was no longer just a murder investigation. It was a puzzle box designed to break us. And I had just found the first false bottom. The flicker of doubt from the previous scene had solidified into a gnawing certainty. The perfect placement, the contradictory patterns, it was too clean, too deliberately messy. My gut, usually a stoic companion, churned with unease. I needed to dive deeper, away from the manipulated tableau into the raw, unadulterated facts. That meant a trip to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. A phrase that always sent a shiver down my spine, less for the pathogens themselves and more for the bureaucratic hoops and sterile isolation it implied. The victim's personal effects, along with a number of biological samples, had been routed there first. Standard protocol when the cause of death was unclear and the scene had presented certain anachronisms. I hated the place. The air, scrubbed and recirculated, tasted of ozone and regret. Every surface gleamed with a disinfected sheen, reflecting the harsh, filtered light from the overhead panels. The steady hum of the ventilation system was a constant drone, a reminder that every breath was processed, every particle scrutinized. It was a place designed for control, for containment, for keeping the unknown at bay. After navigating a series of airlocks and donning the requisite layers of protective gear, a full-body suit that felt like a second, restrictive skin, triple-layered gloves, and a face shield that steamed with every exhalation. I found myself in a small, pressurized examination chamber. On a stainless steel table, neatly arranged in clear, sealed bags, lay the victim's meager possessions. The lead detective, a man whose patience wore thinner than a well-used file, stood opposite me, his own suit rustling with impatience. "Anything, Blake, anything at all that isn't just a dead end." His voice, muffled by the comms in our helmets, held a sharp edge. I ignored him, my gaze already sweeping over the items. A wallet surprisingly thin, containing only a driver's license and a few crumpled bills. A worn, generic smartphone. A set of keys, one for a car, one for an apartment, and a small, unassuming key fob. And then a cheap, plastic-strapped watch. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that screamed murder victim or master manipulator. I reached for the key fob first, the thick gloves making my movements clumsy. I squeezed the plastic bag, turning the fob over in my hand. It was a standard proximity key, black, rectangular, with no obvious branding. But as I rotated it, the light caught something. A faint, almost invisible etching on the smooth surface. "Hold on," I murmured, my voice tighter than I intended. I requested a magnified view on the chamber's internal screen, positioning the fob under the lens. The image resolved, stark and clear. It wasn't just a scratch, it was a symbol. 3 intertwined lines forming a knot, not quite symmetrical, with a small, almost imperceptible dot at the center of the knot. My breath hitched in my throat, fogging my face shield for a moment. I felt a cold dread trickle down my spine, despite the warmth of the suit. My gloved fingers trembled, a tremor I tried to suppress but couldn't quite manage. "What is it?" the detective asked, his tone shifting, sensing my sudden tension. It was nothing. It was everything. The symbol. I'd seen it before, years ago, a different case, a different city. A case that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my sleep for months, long after the official files were closed. The warehouse. The cold, damp air. The victim, almost entirely unidentifiable. And the tiny, almost invisible mark on a discarded piece of fabric. A similar knot, 3 lines, a dot. I had dismissed it, categorized it as incidental damage, a random snag, a manufacturing defect. My report had focused on the more overt trauma, the obvious cause of death. I'd been so fixated on the how, I'd completely overlooked the why. The lead investigator on that case, a grizzled veteran whose instincts were usually infallible, had pressed me. "Are I sure, Blake, that symbol, it feels deliberate?" "It's nothing, sir," I'd insisted, confident in my initial assessment. "Just a frayed edge." I had seen what I expected to see, not what was truly there. The killer, if there even was one, had vanished, leaving behind only questions and the bitter taste of my own professional arrogance. The case was never solved. It became a permanent stain on my record, a silent accusation that I carried like a phantom limb. Now here it was again, on a cheap plastic fob belonging to a victim whose death was already screaming orchestrated. "Blake." The detective's voice snapped me back to the present. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "It's a symbol," I managed, my voice strained. "I've seen something like it before." My mind raced, the sterile chamber fading into the background. Was this the same individual? Or a copycat decades later? Or worse, was this just a coincidence, and I was projecting my own past failures onto an entirely new scenario? Was I so desperate for redemption that I was seeing ghosts where there were none? The self-doubt was a sharp, physical pain. Had I learned nothing? Was I still the same blind, overconfident analyst who missed the obvious because I was looking too hard for the complicated? The detective leaned closer, his helmeted head cocked. "Meaning what? A gang sign? A cult?" "I don't know," I admitted, the words tasting like ash. "But it's not random, it can't be." This wasn't just another case anymore. This was a direct challenge to my professional integrity, a mirror reflecting my deepest fears. The meticulously placed evidence, the subtly misleading scene, and now this symbol. It felt like a personal taunt. I had to be careful, more careful than ever. My judgment was compromised, tainted by a memory that still burned. But that same memory also fueled a new, desperate resolve. I wouldn't let it happen again. I couldn't. This time I would peel back every layer, no matter how perfect the deception, no matter how much it forced me to confront the ghosts I thought I'd buried. This time I wouldn't miss a thing. The symbol still burned behind my eyes. Not just the physical mark, but the echo of it in my mind. A ghost from a past I'd spent years trying to bury under layers of sterile facts and cold logic. My failure. The word clung to the edges of my thoughts, a persistent static in the otherwise silent quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The air in my specialized lab, usually a comforting hum of filtration systems and diagnostic machines, felt heavy, charged with an unspoken challenge. My hands, usually steady, clenched at the memory. This wasn't just another case, a puzzle to be solved and filed away. This was personal, a direct, calculated taunt. I leaned over the expansive workbench, a pristine expanse of stainless steel that reflected the harsh overhead lights. Around me, the evidence lay organized with surgical precision. Fiber samples encased in slides, minute paint chips in Petri dishes, fragments of synthetic material, and the detailed photographs of the primary scene, blown up to poster size. Each item, meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced, now felt like a piece of a master illusionist's trick. Too perfect. My eyes scanned the reports, then the magnified images on the monitor. The victim's apartment, a tableau of carefully arranged chaos. The forced entry just plausible enough. The struggle just violent enough. Everything screamed standard break-in gone wrong, but my gut, that unreliable, inconvenient organ, screamed deception. I picked up a pair of tweezers, my focus narrowing to the microscopic fibers extracted from the victim's clothing. Standard acrylic dyed black, common, too common. I'd run them through every database, cross-referenced them with known manufacturers, even checked obscure textile archives. Nothing. They were unremarkable, which in itself was starting to feel remarkable. "Come on, Blake," I muttered to myself, the sound swallowed by the insulated walls. What are I missing? Hours bled into each other. The facility outside my lab remained quiet, a necessary precaution given the nature of the samples I was processing, some of which were still awaiting clearance due to the suspected pathogen. The isolation was absolute, a perfect echo of my own mental state. I cycled through every piece of evidence again, not looking for what was there, but for what shouldn't be, or what wasn't there. My gaze drifted to the magnified images of a small, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the hardwood floor near where the body was found. It was faint, easily dismissed as routine wear, but something about its curvature, the way the wood fibers were displaced, snagged my attention. It wasn't a clean gouge, nor a simple abrasion. It was a tear, a microscopic, almost deliberate tear. I pulled up the high-resolution scan of the floor sample I'd taken. Under the electron microscope, the scuff transformed into a landscape of splintered wood, and there it was. Not a simple tear, but a series of minute, almost geometric stress fractures radiating from the initial point of impact. They weren't random. They followed a specific, almost crystalline pattern. "Wait," I breathed, leaning closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. "That doesn't add up." A natural scuff, a shoe dragging across the floor, would create a more diffuse, irregular pattern of damage. This was too precise, too structured. It was as if whatever caused the scuff had been designed to inflict this specific type of minute pattern damage. My mind raced. Could this be the signature? Something so subtle, so easily overlooked, yet screaming intentionality. I remembered the fibers, the common black acrylic. I'd focused on their composition, not their integrity. With a surge of renewed energy, I went back to the fiber samples. I loaded a fresh slide into the electron microscope, selecting a few strands that had shown minor signs of fraying. I increased the magnification, pushing the machine to its limits. There. It wasn't immediately obvious. It was woven into the very structure of the synthetic material. Tiny, almost imperceptible micro-incisions. Not cuts, not shears, but minute, almost surgical tears, mirroring the stress fractures in the wood. They ran along the length of the fibers, parallel, spaced with unnerving regularity. They were too small to affect the overall appearance of the fabric, but under extreme magnification they were undeniable. My breath hitched. This wasn't accidental wear. This wasn't manufacturing defect. This was designed. Someone had meticulously, painstakingly applied a specific type of stress or used a unique tool to create these patterned micro-incisions on the fibers. And then they had left them there, knowing they would be dismissed as generic wear. I cross-referenced the fiber samples with other materials from the scene: a torn piece of curtain, a fragment of the victim's belt, even a tiny speck of residue from the lock mechanism. On each, with painstaking effort and extreme magnification, I found it. The same unique stress fracture pattern, the same geometric micro-incisions. Consistent, identical. This wasn't a mistake. This was a statement, a signature left in plain sight, hidden by its very subtlety. The killer hadn't just cleaned up. They had engineered the scene down to the microscopic level to mislead. They had chosen materials that would show this specific, almost artistic pattern of damage, knowing that standard forensic analysis would overlook it. A cold dread settled in my stomach, quickly followed by a jolt of exhilaration. This killer wasn't just cunning. They were meticulous to a degree I hadn't encountered before. This was their arrogance, their challenge, and it was brilliant. My hands, though still, now trembled with a different kind of energy. The symbol, the perfectly imperfect scene, and now these microscopic signatures, it all spoke of a killer who didn't just commit murder but crafted it. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. This was about proving that even the most meticulous deception could be unraveled, and I was going to be the one to do it. Could this be the signature? My mind raced, grappling with the implication. A natural scuff, a shoe dragging across the floor, would create a more diffuse, irregular pattern of damage. This was too precise, too structured, not a careless slip but a deliberate mark. A calling card, perhaps, left with chilling confidence. The killer wasn't just meticulous, they were arrogant, or more unsettlingly, they wanted me to think they were arrogant. They were leaving breadcrumbs not to be caught but to be understood. And that, I knew from bitter experience, made them infinitely more dangerous than a simple psychopath. A killer with a message, a purpose, was a force of nature. My thoughts were cut short by the insistent buzz of my comm unit. "Blake, we have a situation. New recovery from the perimeter, high priority flag. You need to get to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. Immediately." The voice of the precinct chief was clipped, laced with an urgency that tightened my stomach. A new recovery, and a quarantine facility. This investigation was determined to push me out of my comfort zone, not just mentally but physically. The thought of donning a full biohazard suit, the muffled world it created, the sterile air, made my skin crawl, but the work didn't stop. The drive was short, but the transition into the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, felt like crossing into another dimension. The air outside was crisp, city-scented. Inside, after a meticulous decontamination protocol, the air was scrubbed, scentless and recycled, humming with the quiet thrum of filtration systems. I moved through a series of airlocks, each one sealing off the outside world a little more, until I stood in the main containment chamber, encased in my protective suit. The thick visor distorted my vision slightly, and my own breathing was amplified, a constant reminder of the barrier between me and the environment. The chamber was a stark white cube, illuminated by harsh overhead lights that cast no shadows. In the center, on a gleaming stainless steel table, sat a clear containment box. Inside, nestled on a sterile pad, was the new recovery. It was a small metallic cylinder, no larger than my thumb. It looked innocuous, almost like a piece of industrial hardware, but its surface gleamed with an unnatural cleanliness. Found partially buried, just beyond the initial cordon, the lead containment specialist explained, their voice crackling through my comms. Our initial scan flagged it. No definitive match for known biologicals, but some trace elements were unusual. We isolated it. I leaned closer, my gloved hands hovering above the box. The cylinder was smooth, machined with precision. too precise for something found partially buried. It hadn't been lost, it had been placed. Another signature, another breadcrumb. My internal monologue was a rapid-fire analysis, connecting this new discovery to the patterned scuff marks. The same meticulousness, the same almost theatrical placement. "Can we get a closer look at the surface?" I asked, my voice flat through the comms. The specialist nodded, adjusting a high-magnification camera mounted above the box. The feed appeared on a monitor to my right, showing the cylinder's surface in extreme detail. And there it was. Not immediately obvious, almost a ghost of an impression. A faint etching, barely visible to the naked eye, a stylized symbol. It wasn't a corporate logo, nor was it a recognizable letter or number. It was abstract, a series of interlocking lines forming a distorted, almost skeletal representation of something, a bird, a key. It was ambiguous yet deliberate. This was the event. This was a direct, undeniable communication from the killer. "Zoom in on that etching," I commanded, my heart rate picking up. The image pixelated slightly as the camera pushed its limits, but the symbol became clearer. It felt ancient yet modern, a paradox. I pulled up an archive database on my wrist-mounted device, cross-referencing symbols, defunct corporate logos, historical markers, even obscure cultural motifs. Nothing. This was unique, or more likely, uniquely obscure. Then it hit me. The lines, the specific angles, the way they interlocked. It wasn't a symbol of something, it was a symbol from somewhere. I started filtering my search, not for what it represented, but for its construction. Architectural blueprints, specific engineering schematics, perhaps even defunct patents from specialized manufacturing. My fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, the air in my suit growing warm. And then a flicker. A match. Not exact, but strikingly similar in its geometric language. It was a conceptual design from a failed industrial project, nearly 20 years old. A massive, ambitious venture to develop a unique, resilient material for extreme environmental conditions. The project had been shut down abruptly, shrouded in controversy and accusations of corporate malfeasance. Key personnel had vanished, careers had been destroyed. Reveal/discovery. The symbol wasn't just a mark, it was a ghost. This killer wasn't just seeking attention, they were seeking retribution. The twisted sense of justice theory solidified in my mind. Someone involved in that failed project, someone who felt wronged, whose life had been derailed. They weren't just killing a victim, they were sending a message, a brutal reminder of an old wound, but why now? Why resurface after 2 decades? And what did the victim have to do with a long-dead industrial project? The pieces were starting to form a grim mosaic, but the picture was still incomplete. The precision, the deliberate nature of the clues, the arrogance of the signature, it all pointed to a mind that had been stewing, planning, perfecting this moment for years. This wasn't a simple revenge plot, and the fact that they were now leaving clues that directly referenced a specific, controversial past event, it meant they wanted to be connected to it. They wanted the world to remember. My initial thought that the killer was merely arrogant now felt too simplistic. This wasn't just about ego. It was about exposing something, righting a perceived wrong, and they were willing to orchestrate a macabre performance to achieve it. I had underestimated their depth, their purpose. The pathogen might be contained, but the killer's contagion was spreading, infecting the very fabric of the investigation. And I was standing right in its path. The cylinder, cold and heavy in my gloved palm, felt less like a piece of evidence and more like a challenge. Its machined surface gleamed under the sterile light of the mobile forensics unit, a stark contrast to the rough earth it had supposedly emerged from. Placed, I'd thought, and the word still echoed in my mind. Not lost, not buried by chance. Deliberate. A breadcrumb, yes, but leading where? My gut churned with a familiar unease. The meticulousness of the crime scenes, the almost theatrical presentation of the evidence, it all screamed calculated manipulation. This wasn't a desperate killer covering tracks. This was an artist performing for an audience of one. Me. The next step was obvious and unsettling. The initial reports from the scene mentioned a faint, unusual residue clinging to the cylinder, something that hadn't been fully identified. Given the ongoing investigation into the victim's sudden, rapid decline, a decline that had baffled the initial responders and led to the current heightened alert, only one place was equipped to handle it. "We need to move this to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected," I told the lead investigator. My voice clipped. "Now, full containment protocols." The drive was tense, the cityscape giving way to the stark, imposing architecture of the facility. It wasn't a structure designed for comfort but for control. Concrete and steel, windowless and fortress against the unseen. As we approached the main airlock, the air grew colder, heavy with the hum of ventilation systems and the distant thrum of unseen machinery. Inside, it was a world of white and stainless steel. Every surface gleamed, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The air, filtered to an absurd degree, felt thin, almost brittle. We moved through a series of interlocking chambers, each one sealing behind us with a pneumatic hiss, until we reached the inner sanctum, a sterile laboratory designed for handling the most dangerous biological agents. My colleague, a specialist in biohazard containment, met me at the final seal, already in full environmental protection gear. Their visor was opaque, their voice a crackle through the comms unit. "Blake, everything's prepped. Level 4 containment, what have you got for me?" I held up the cylinder, encased in its clear, sealed transport box. He was found near the victim. Preliminary scans showed trace residue. Could be nothing, could be everything. The colleague nodded, gesturing towards a reinforced analytical station. "Let's see if our killer has a particularly nasty calling card." Hours blurred into a methodical dance of analysis. Scanners hummed, spectral graphs scrolled across monitors, and the air filled with the faint, metallic tang of ozone. The trace residue turned out to be inert, a complex polymer, non-biological, non-toxic. Another dead end, another piece of misdirection. My frustration simmered just beneath the surface. This killer delighted in these elaborate diversions. But then, as I was preparing to log the cylinder as residue negative, further physical examination required, something caught my eye. Under the high magnification microscope, a faint etching appeared on the cylinder's surface, almost invisible to the naked eye, obscured by the slight wear. It wasn't random. It was a precise, intricate pattern. "Hold on," I murmured, adjusting the focus. "There's something here." My colleague leaned closer, their helmeted head hovering over my shoulder. "What is it?" It was a stylized raven, wings spread, beak open in a silent cry. Small, no bigger than my thumbnail, but exquisitely detailed. My breath hitched. The raven. It was the raven. A symbol I hadn't seen in years, a personal emblem from a past I had desperately tried to bury. It was the same raven that had been etched into the silver locket my older sister had given me when I was a child. The one I'd lost, or had it been taken during? No, not a signature, a message for me. This wasn't just a clue, it was a direct taunt, an invasion. How could the killer know about the raven? How could they know about that locket, that specific, obscure detail from my past? It didn't add up. None of the victims had any apparent connection to my personal history or to each other beyond the elaborate crime scenes. This felt too deliberate, too intimate, too personal. Wait, that doesn't add up. Was I seeing things? Was the stress getting to me? Was I projecting? The thought made me doubt my own judgment, my own sanity, for a fleeting, terrifying second. As I stared at the etched raven, a sharp, piercing whine suddenly cut through the sterile quiet of the lab. My comms unit crackled violently, and the main monitor in front of me flickered, the complex data streams dissolving into static. The overhead lights pulsed, dimming then flaring before settling back into their harsh glow. "System anomaly," my colleague's voice snapped, laced with a sudden urgency. "Localized power surge in Sector Gamma, checking diagnostics." But it wasn't just a power surge. On my personal monitor, the one linked to my analysis station, a single, distorted image flickered into existence, overriding all other displays. It was the raven again, but this time it was animated, its wings slowly beating, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent red light. Then a synthesized voice, metallic and devoid of inflection, cut through the comms, directly into my earpiece, bypassing the facility's main broadcast. The raven flies again, replaced by the normal data streams. My comms unit went silent, then returned to the static hiss of the open channel. The power surge indicators on the main screen had already normalized. It was as if nothing had happened, but it had. This was personal. The killer knew me, knew my past, and they were here, watching, inside the very walls of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The game had just escalated into a full-blown war, and I was the target. The system hummed, a low, steady thrum against the sudden silence of my own thoughts. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound. It wasn't pounding, but the rhythm of my pulse felt heavy, a dull thud against my ribs. The image, that fleeting, impossible flash on my screen, had been too specific, too personal. It defied every rational explanation, yet it had been there. A ghost in the machine, or something far more tangible and sinister. I spent the next hour rerunning diagnostics, checking every system log, every network packet. Nothing. The surge indicators were flat, the comms unit stable. It was as if my entire workstation had simply blinked. But the memory of that distorted face, the flicker of recognition I felt before it dissolved, clung to the back of my mind like a burr. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a momentary hallucination brought on by fatigue and the sheer pressure of the case. But a forensic scientist doesn't get to dismiss things. We chase the anomalies, the outliers, the things that don't fit. This definitely didn't fit. The next morning, I found myself in the sterile, almost suffocating environment of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. A new batch of recovered data drives had been brought in, deemed potentially contaminated from a secondary crime scene connected to the victim's known associates. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and disinfectant, and every surface gleamed with an unnerving clinical perfection. I was encased in a full-body biohazard suit, the filtered air hissing softly around my face, making my own voice sound muffled and distant even to myself. My task was to review the integrity of the data recovered from the drives. Standard procedure. The drives themselves were sealed in clear, hardened containers, placed in a specialized chamber where I could operate robotic arms to connect them to my console. I worked in silence, the only sounds the soft clicks of the console, the occasional whir of a cooling fan, and my own steady breathing. The first few drives were uneventful, a mundane collection of personal files, work documents, and encrypted communications. Nothing that screamed murder. My fingers moved across the haptic interface, scrolling through endless lines of code and file names. Then on the third drive, I hit something odd. It was a folder, buried several layers deep within a seemingly innocuous project files directory. The creation date was recent, too recent for the drive's last known activity, and the permissions were unusual, restricted. Even for me, with my elevated access, it required a secondary override. A red flag immediately went up. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide a folder on a drive that was destined for forensic analysis? Unless they wanted it to be found, but only by someone with the right level of persistence, or conversely, they wanted to make it difficult enough that a cursory glance would miss it. I initiated the override sequence. The system chimed, a small victory. Inside, there were only a handful of files. Not data logs, not documents. They were audio recordings, encrypted naturally. I started the decryption process. It was slow, the facility's isolated network not built for speed but security. I watched the progress bar inch forward, a growing knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Finally, the first file unlocked. I put on my specialized headphones, the sound piped directly into my helmet. It was a conversation. Two voices, hushed, almost conspiratorial. One I recognized immediately, the lead investigator on the case. His voice, usually gruff and direct, was softer now, tinged with a strange deference. The other voice was distorted, electronically masked, but the cadence, the deliberate pauses felt familiar. I couldn't place it, but the unease intensified. The evidence at the warehouse, the lead investigator said, his voice low. It's all there exactly as we discussed. He'll find what he needs to, nothing more. The timeline will hold. Good, the distorted voice replied, a dry, almost amused tone. And Blake, is he pliable? A jolt went through me, my name, my entire body stiffened, doesn't trust easily. He won't look beyond what's presented to him, especially if the narrative is compelling enough. Make sure it is, the distorted voice ordered. And ensure the access logs for the facility are adjusted. We can't have anyone tracing the secondary transfer of the device. The conversation continued, detailing specific pieces of evidence, how they were to be managed, how the narrative was to be reinforced. It wasn't just obstruction, it was active fabrication. A meticulous construction designed to lead me down a very specific path, away from the truth. They were building a case, not solving one. And the lead investigator, the man I'd been working alongside, sharing theories, dissecting evidence with, was a part of it. He was actively participating in the deception. My breath caught in my throat. The sterile air suddenly felt thin, constricting. I stared at the waveform on the screen, the green lines dancing with the betraying voices. My mind raced, replaying every interaction with the lead investigator, every shared glance, every seemingly casual comment. He hadn't just been misdirected, he was a misdirector. He hadn't just been duped, he was a perpetrator of the duping. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. The meticulously placed evidence, the perfect narrative, it wasn't the killer's genius I was up against. It was a conspiracy. An internal one. Someone within the very system designed to deliver justice was actively working to subvert it, to frame someone, or to protect the real killer. And they were using me, using my meticulous nature, my dedication to detail, to solidify their false narrative. The cynicism that I usually kept carefully compartmentalized, a professional detachment now welled up, a bitter taste in my mouth. I had always operated under the assumption that, even with office politics and differing opinions, everyone on a case was fundamentally chasing the same truth. Now that assumption lay shattered, fragments scattered across the pristine console in front of me. I pulled off the headphones. The sudden silence was deafening. The lead investigator, the man who had been my primary contact, the bridge between my lab and the field. He had been feeding me carefully curated information, guiding my interpretations, setting the stage for a conclusion he and his co-conspirator had already decided upon. Who was the distorted voice? And what was their motive? It wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about a deeper corruption, a rot at the core of the investigation itself. Everyone was suspect now. Every piece of information, every seemingly innocuous detail, had to be reevaluated, filtered through this new, horrifying lens of deliberate deception. I was no longer just a forensic scientist on a murder case. I was a target, an unwitting pawn, and now, a silent witness to an unfolding betrayal that went far beyond the boundaries of this single investigation. The determination to uncover the truth hardened within me, but it was now laced with a potent dose of suspicion and a deep, unsettling fear. This wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about exposing a rot that threatened to consume everything. And I was standing right in the middle of it, sealed off from the world, alone in the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, with a secret that could unravel everything. They were building a cage around me, brick by brick, lie by lie. The sheer audacity of it, the cold precision, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the stale air in my office. My previous assumptions, my carefully constructed theories, now felt like sandcastles against an incoming tide. I couldn't trust the reports, couldn't trust the official channels. Everything I had been given, everything I had found, was tainted. The quiet hum of the ventilation system was the only sound in my lab, a constant drone that usually soothed me. Tonight, It felt like a mocking whisper. I stared at the holographic display, the schematics of the crime scene laid out in shimmering blue lines. My gaze drifted to the specific items of evidence that had been managed, the ones designed to paint a picture I now knew was false. I couldn't just walk away. My career, my reputation, perhaps even my freedom were on the line. But more than that, the truth. It was a visceral need, a clawing hunger inside me. I had to find a thread that wasn't part of their weave, a loose end they'd overlooked. My eyes narrowed on a particular piece of trace evidence I'd cataloged weeks ago from the initial scene, a microscopic, almost translucent residue clinging to a discarded fabric scrap. At the time, I'd logged it as unidentified environmental contaminant, a common enough occurrence given the urban setting. It hadn't fit the initial, convenient narrative, so I'd set it aside, intending to revisit it if other avenues dried up. Now, it screamed at me. What if it wasn't environmental? What if it was purposeful? I pulled up the original analysis data, a tangle of spectral graphs and molecular structures. The residue was a complex synthetic polymer, almost crystalline in its composition, with a faint, unusual metallic signature, too unique to be random street grit. My first thought was industrial lubricant, but the specific molecular chains didn't quite match anything in the standard databases. I spent the next 3 hours, hunched over the microscope, then hunched over my console, cross-referencing the polymer's unique profile against specialized material databases. Not general industry, I realized, but niche applications. Highly specific, high-performance materials. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. My mind raced, connecting disparate data points, discarding irrelevant ones. The air in the lab grew heavy, charged with my singular focus. Then a hit. Not a perfect match, but a close enough cousin to raise the hairs on my arms. A sealant. A specialized, high-grade, self-repairing polymer sealant, primarily used in environments requiring extreme containment and sterility. Places where even microscopic leaks could have catastrophic consequences. Places like a list of facilities popped up, cross-referenced with local government permits and environmental impact reports. Most were secure data centers or advanced manufacturing plants. But one name on the list made my breath catch in my throat. Quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. My initial thought was that it had to be a coincidence. Why would a killer use such a place? The very name conjured images of biohazard suits and airlocks, but then I remembered the meticulousness of the fabrication, the precise, almost surgical way the false narrative had been constructed. This wasn't some desperate amateur act. This was orchestrated, and a facility designed for extreme containment offered a unique blend of security, isolation, and specialized equipment. It was the perfect place to conduct illicit operations without interruption, a place no one would dare approach without official clearance. I pulled up what public records I could find for the facility. It was remote, tucked away in an old industrial park on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a high, unkempt fence. Its last official operational date was listed as 5 years ago, mothballed pending future research initiatives. But the permits for waste disposal and utility maintenance were still active, renewed annually. Someone was keeping it running. They was I chasing ghosts. They was this just a wild tangent, fueled by my escalating paranoia. It felt almost too neat, too convenient to connect a microscopic residue to such a specific, ominous location. For a moment, I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Had I simply convinced myself of this elaborate conspiracy, overlooking simpler explanations? The doubt gnawed at me, a sharp, unwelcome toothache in my concentration. But then, the memory of that recorded conversation, the casual dismissal of truth, solidified my resolve. No, this wasn't paranoia. This was a pattern I was finally seeing. I knew I couldn't go through official channels. The people I suspected were in those channels. I had to go alone. It was well past midnight when I finally locked up my lab, the city outside a sleeping silhouette. My old sedan, usually reliable, felt like a target as I drove through the deserted streets. The tension was a living thing in the car, a low thrum beneath the engine's purr. The facility was exactly as the records described, isolated, overgrown, and disturbingly quiet. The chain-link fence, topped with rusted barbed wire, was easily bypassed where a section had been forced open and crudely resecured with zip ties. Amateurish, almost an invitation. Too easy. My guard went up immediately. The air inside the perimeter was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp concrete and something metallic, like ozone. I moved cautiously, my hand gripping the small, specialized forensic kit I'd brought. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over peeling paint and rusted machinery. The entrance was secured by a heavy, reinforced steel door, but a smaller, less obvious service entrance around the back stood slightly ajar. More zip ties snapped. Someone had been here recently. Someone was here now. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against my resolve. Every creak of the old building, every scuttling sound, sent a jolt through me. I moved through a labyrinth of empty decontamination chambers, past dormant air filtration units. Then I saw it, a faint glow from a room at the end of a long, narrow corridor. I flattened myself against the wall, inching forward. The light pulsed rhythmically, a soft, bluish hue. I peered around the door frame. The room was not what I expected. It was a makeshift laboratory, clean and organized, but clearly not part of the original facility's design. In the center, a workbench held an array of specialized equipment, precision instruments, chemical reagents, and a small, high-intensity UV lamp. And on the workbench, under the bluish glow, were several items. My breath hitched. They were the very pieces of managed evidence I'd been agonizing over. Not the originals, but exact duplicates, meticulously crafted, each one imbued with the same precise, false forensic signature. Someone had been practicing, rehearsing, and then I saw the final piece, tucked away in a clear, sealed container beside the duplicates. It was a single, tarnished silver locket, intricately engraved with a unique, stylized crest, the very crest I'd seen in a faded photograph on the desk of the lead detective investigating the case. A personal item, clearly belonging to him, left behind in the fabrication workshop. The air went out of my lungs in a painful rush. It wasn't just obstruction or fabrication. It was a betrayal from within. The lead detective, the one who had guided my investigation, the one who had subtly steered me away from the truth, was the architect of this deception. And this facility was his hidden workshop, his secret forge of lies. The name Quarantine Facility, unknown pathogen suspected, pulsed on the screen, a digital siren call. My initial thought, a cold dread that had nothing to do with any biological threat, tightened its grip. This wasn't just a secure location. It was a purpose-built secure location, designed for isolation and containment. Why would a meticulous, almost artistic killer, one who crafted evidence with such surgical precision, need such a place? The answer, when it clicked, was like a tumbler falling into place in a high-security lock. This wasn't about hiding evidence. It was about preparing it. A sterile environment, controlled conditions, a place where a twisted sculptor could mold their grim masterpiece without interference, without contamination, ensuring every detail was exactly as they intended. The too perfect evidence wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate statement, forged in a crucible of isolation. I traced the address on the screen with a finger, the faint glow reflecting in my eyes. It was remote, nestled in a forgotten industrial park on the city's outskirts, a place I'd only know existed if I had reason to. My gut screamed at me to call the detective, to bring in a team, but a colder, more insistent voice whispered, "No." This felt personal now. The killer had left a trail, not for the authorities, but for me. They wanted me to find this. They wanted me to walk into it. A knot formed in my stomach. Was I being arrogant, foolish? Maybe. And if I was right, bringing a conventional team in now might just alert the killer, send them scrambling, and destroy any chance of understanding their twisted logic. This was a psychological game, and I had to play it on their terms, at least initially. I left a vague message with a colleague about pursuing an obscure lead, careful not to give specifics. I knew I was walking into something dangerous, possibly irreversible. But the compulsion to understand, to peel back the final layer of this meticulously constructed lie, was overwhelming. The drive was long, the urban sprawl slowly giving way to forgotten warehouses and overgrown lots. The GPS on my phone eventually led me down a narrow, unpaved road, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The facility loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of gray concrete and steel, devoid of windows. High fences topped with barbed wire encircled the perimeter, and a single, heavy-duty gate, thankfully ajar, offered an unsettling invitation. No security cameras were visible, or at least none that were obvious. A careful killer. It prickled at the back of my throat. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the city, a sound that felt alien and far away. I pushed the heavy gate further open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Beyond it, a desolate courtyard stretched to the main entrance, a massive, reinforced door that looked capable of withstanding a siege. This wasn't just a secure building, it was a fortress, and it was waiting for me. My hand instinctively went to the pistol at my hip, the cold metal a small comfort. I tried the main door, locked as expected, but then I noticed a faint scratch mark on the lower right panel, almost imperceptible. I knelt, examining it closely. Not a forced entry mark, but a deliberate, almost artistic gouge, and beneath it another, smaller scratch forming an arrow pointing to a keypad beside the door, a trap or an invitation. My breath hitched. The killer wasn't just waiting, they were guiding me. They wanted me to enter their way. I ran my gloved finger over the keypad, noting the faint sheen on some of the buttons indicating recent use. I pulled out my UV light. Several numbers glowed faintly, a sequence forming. I entered the code, my fingers steady despite the tremor in my gut. A soft click echoed from within, and the heavy door swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit interior. This wasn't just a facility, it was a stage. I moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The silence was broken only by my own footsteps, echoing unnervingly. Each door I passed was heavy, sealed, and unmarked. I pushed on, deeper into the heart of the facility, following an unseen thread the killer had left for me. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible click. It came from an open doorway at the end of the corridor where a single, brighter light glowed. I edged towards the doorway, my flashlight beam cutting a path. The room was large, a laboratory of sorts but stripped bare. Stainless steel tables, a few empty shelves, and in the center, a single chair. And on the chair, something glinted, a photograph, tacked to the back of the chair facing me. It was a picture of me, young, fresh out of the academy, standing proudly beside my first major case file. A case I had solved, a case that had cemented my reputation. A case that, in retrospect, had felt too easy. The voice was familiar, yet alien. It wasn't the detective's. It wasn't any colleague I had spoken to recently. It was the voice of someone I knew, someone I had trusted, someone who had been there in the background all along. I spun around, pistol raised, the beam of my flashlight momentarily blinding. But as they lowered it, my breath caught in my throat. It was the head of the forensic department, the one who had signed off on my initial reports, the one who had praised my work on the very case in the photograph. I didn't just know, I created it. Every perfect piece of evidence, every meticulous detail. The betrayals, the professional and personal, suddenly converged into a horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a murder, it was an elaborate, twisted demonstration. And I was the star pupil, walking straight into the final lesson. Why? I demanded, my voice raw, trying to keep my focus, trying to find the flaw in their perfect plan, the one detail they might have overlooked. They chuckled, a dry, academic sound that sent shivers down my spine. Because the truth, Blake, is rarely perfect. It wasn't for an unknown pathogen. It was for a very known one, the pathogen of unquestioning belief in the absolute truth of evidence. and I was its most virulent carrier. A sickening wave of self-doubt washed over me. Had I been so blind, so consumed by my own precision, my own pursuit of what I believed was undeniable truth, that I had missed the master puppeteer pulling the strings? Had my own past, my relentless need to be right, made me the perfect target for this twisted game? The psychological confrontation had begun. The gnawing doubt from the previous night had solidified into a cold, hard certainty, a razor-sharp edge that now propelled me forward. I wasn't blind. I had been engineered. My own mind, my own unwavering dedication to forensic truth, had been weaponized against me. The master puppeteer had understood me better than I understood myself. The air in the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, hung heavy and still, smelling of disinfectant and something metallic, a scent that always made my teeth ache. The facility was a sprawling, windowless bunker, a series of interconnected sterile zones designed to contain the uncontainable. It was the perfect stage for a final act of control, a place where a killer could orchestrate chaos, or, more likely, disappear. My footsteps echoed on the polished concrete, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I moved through a series of airlocks, the heavy doors hissing and clunking behind me, sealing me deeper within the labyrinth. My comms device was dead, deliberately jammed, I suspected. No backup, just me. Just the truth I had finally pieced together. I found the lead investigator in the central containment lab, a room filled with gleaming stainless steel surfaces and sealed biohazard cabinets. He wasn't wearing protective gear, just his standard field jacket, leaning against a workbench, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He hadn't expected me, not exactly, but he wasn't surprised either. The confirmation, spoken so casually, hit harder than any physical blow. "You," I managed, the word a rusty grate in my throat. "All of it. You set the stage." He pushed off the workbench, slowly, deliberately. A master craftsman appreciates a finely executed plan. And you, Blake, you appreciate precision. That's why I chose you. Your meticulousness, your need to connect every single microscopic dot. It was my greatest asset. The impossible trajectory, I stated, my voice gaining strength, each word a hammer blow against his carefully constructed facade. The way the impact angle didn't quite match the velocity, even with the calculations. It was off, just enough to make me question my own measurements, to make me redo them, confirming what you wanted me to find. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "You spent days on that, didn't you? Rerunning simulations, calibrating, doubting your own instruments. Beautiful. You were so focused on the how, you missed the why. And the fibers," I continued, pacing slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his. "The perfect, pristine fibers at the secondary scene. No cross-contamination, no degradation. They shouldn't have been that clean, not after what they supposedly went through. You introduced them after the fact, didn't you? Planted them. You knew I'd find them, knew I'd trace them to the frame." His smile widened, devoid of warmth. A touch of artistic flair. "Everyone expects a mess. I provided order. I provided a narrative that made sense, a narrative that I would validate with your undeniable science." "The victim," I pressed, the anger finally igniting, burning through the lingering shock. "What was their part in this? Why frame the colleague? Why all the elaborate layers?" "The victim was a pawn," he replied, shrugging. "A necessary casualty, and the colleague, well, he was a convenient scapegoat. Always complaining, always disgruntled. And more importantly, he had access. So easy to slip something into his workspace knowing you'd find it." My mind raced, connecting the final dots. It wasn't about the victim, was it? Not really. It was about me, about making me prove something that wasn't true, about breaking my conviction in the science. He clapped his hands together once, a sharp sound in the sterile room. "Bingo! You caught a killer once, Blake. A killer I believed was innocent. You put away a man based on your undeniable truth, a truth I knew was flawed. I spent years watching him languish, knowing he was wrongly accused. You needed to understand what it felt like to be manipulated, to have your certainty shattered by a greater deception." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. The old case. The one that had defined my early career, the one I'd always considered my greatest triumph. It was the ghost I'd never quite laid to rest. He had been working to undermine me, to make me doubt everything I stood for, using my own past trauma and my unwavering belief in evidence as his weapon. You wanted to dismantle my career, all pretense of cordiality gone. I wanted I to understand the cost of being wrong, the cost of blind faith in my own infallible methods. I wanted I to see the innocent suffer because of my truth. He took a step towards me, and I instinctively braced myself. But I didn't just plant evidence, did I? I orchestrated the pathogen scare in this facility. Why here? What was the ultimate end game? A final flourish, he answered, his hand moving towards a panel on the wall. A perfect escape, a containment breach, a facility-wide lockdown. Chaos. In the confusion, who would notice one more casualty? He wasn't just trying to escape, he was planning to make sure I couldn't tell anyone. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about survival. You won't get away with it, I responded, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Oh, I think I will, he countered, his finger hovering over a red button on the panel. Or at least you won't be around to stop me. Before his finger could descend, I lunged. It was a desperate, unthinking act fueled by adrenaline and the grim realization of his true intent. My shoulder slammed into his chest, knocking him off balance. He grunted a surprised sound, and we tumbled to the cold floor, the air thick with the smell of my own fear and his calculated malice. He was stronger than he looked, a wiry strength born of desperation. We grappled, rolling across the sterile tiles. His elbow caught me in the jaw, sending a jolt of pain through my teeth. I tasted blood. My fingers scrabbled for purchase, trying to find an advantage, anything to stop him from reaching that panel. He tried to pin my arms, his face contorted with effort, no longer the calm, intellectual manipulator. He was a cornered animal now, fighting for his freedom, for the twisted justice he believed he was owed. I twisted, using my momentum, trying to get to my feet. He kicked out, catching my knee, and I stumbled, falling back against a steel cabinet. The impact rattled my teeth. He scrambled back towards the panel, his eyes fixed on the red button. This was it, the final move. If he pressed it, the facility would be sealed, alarms would blare, and the unknown pathogen would become a very real threat, a perfect cover for his escape, or worse. With a roar that tore from my own lungs, a sound I barely recognized as my own, I threw myself forward, a desperate final lunge. My hand shot out, not for him, but for the panel itself, slamming down on his wrist just as his finger brushed the button. A jolt of pain shot up my arm as our hands connected, but the button remained unpressed. He screamed, a high, frustrated sound, and twisted his hand, trying to break my grip. I held on, gripped tight, my entire body trembling with the effort. My vision blurred at the edges, my muscles screaming in protest. This wasn't about precision or intellectual deduction anymore. This was raw, primal will. It ends here, I gasped, my voice hoarse, my breath ragged. All of it. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I twisted his arm, forcing him away from the panel, driving his back against the wall. I stood over him, panting, my body screaming with exhaustion and pain, but my mind finally was clear. The truth in all its brutal, manipulative glory lay exposed. The master puppeteer had been revealed. The strings were cut. My lungs burned, a raw, ragged ache with every gasp. The metallic tang of my own fear and exertion coated my tongue. The stranger, the killer, slumped against the cold, sterile wall of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. His chest still heaving, his eyes, even in defeat, retaining that unnerving glacial fury. I stood over him, my own body screaming a symphony of protest, a twisted knee, a bruised rib, a dozen smaller pains I hadn't yet registered. But beneath the exhaustion, a grim satisfaction simmered. I'd done it. A sudden jarring clang echoed from the far end of the corridor. Heavy boots, voices, relief, sharp and sudden, almost buckled my knees. "Blake, you all right?" It was the detective, his voice a guttural rumble. He appeared around the corner, followed by a tactical unit, their rifles raised, flashlights sweeping. Here I managed my voice hoarse. He secured. The scene erupted into controlled chaos. The tactical team moved with practiced efficiency, securing the killer, cuffing him, running a quick check for weapons. The detective was by my side in an instant, his gaze sweeping over me, then the subdued figure. "Damn, Blake, you look like you went 10 rounds with a badger." I just nodded, leaning heavily against the wall opposite the killer, trying to catch my breath. The sterile air, usually a comfort, now felt thin, charged with the lingering residue of violence. The facility's eerie quiet, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems, returned as the immediate threat was neutralized. "Any other threats?" the tactical leader asked. His voice clipped. "No," I confirmed, pushing off the wall, testing my weight on my bruised leg. "Just him." They escorted the killer away, his eyes still locked on me until he was out of sight. That unwavering intensity, even in defeat, sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just rage, it was a profound, almost religious conviction. That was the missing piece, I realized. The why. The detective turned to me, his expression serious. "Okay, Blake, talk to me. Everything." We moved slowly, carefully back through the labyrinthine corridors of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The air, usually so clean and regulated, seemed to hum with the aftershocks of the confrontation. I recounted the sequence of events, my voice gaining strength as the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by the clarity of purpose. I explained how I'd deduced the killer's pattern, the subtle misdirections, the deliberate planting of perfect evidence that had screamed too perfect to my instincts. "He wanted to be caught, didn't he?" The detective mused, rubbing his chin. "But not easily. He wanted to make a statement." "More than that," I corrected, my mind already racing, connecting the final dots. "He wanted to prove a point, to expose the flaws in our methods and our assumptions. He knew someone would eventually see through it, but he set up a gauntlet, a challenge." We reached a small, isolated observation room overlooking one of the empty containment zones. The glass was thick, soundproof. A colleague, a data analyst, was already there, hunched over a portable terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He looked up, his eyes wide with relief. "Blake, we were getting worried, lost your signal for a bit." "He jammed it," I explained, gesturing vaguely in the direction the killer had been taken. "Part of his plan, I imagine. Isolation." "Well, we've got a lot more now," the analyst said, turning the screen slightly. "He left a manifesto, hidden in a dead drop in one of the facility's old data banks. We just decrypted it." My breath hitched. A manifesto, that explained the conviction. "What does it say?" The analyst scrolled and text filled the screen. It was dense, rambling in places, but chillingly coherent. The killer, I learned, had been a brilliant but disgraced bioengineer, unjustly accused years ago of corporate espionage, his career ruined, his reputation in tatters. The analyst explained, or to the legal system that condemned him. "And the method," I added, stepping closer to the screen, my gaze fixed on a particular paragraph. "The perfect crime." He meticulously studied forensic procedures. He knew how evidence was collected, analyzed. He knew what we'd look for. He designed the crime scenes to tell a specific, misleading story, one that would implicate others or simply baffle us, all while leaving a trail, a breadcrumb, only someone who thought outside the box would follow. The detective nodded slowly, like a riddle. He wanted someone to solve it, not just process it. "Exactly," I added, a wave of vindication washing over me. All those times I'd felt that gnawing unease, the nagging sensation that something was off with the pristine evidence, the too neat narratives. I hadn't been crazy. My gut had been right. He was playing us. He was playing me. "He even mentions Blake," the analyst said, scrolling further down the document. My eyes widened. He followed my work, my high-profile cases. He saw I as the one who might actually see his message, his truth. He wanted to prove that even the most perfect system could be manipulated, that justice was often blind. He hadn't just wanted to get caught, he'd wanted to be understood. He'd chosen me as his audience. The complex web of personal and professional betrayals mentioned in the premise suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't just about his past. It was about exposing the corruption he perceived, using the very tools of justice against itself. And I, with my own history of fighting for what was right against internal politics and flawed assumptions, was the perfect foil. He saw a kindred spirit, perhaps, but one he intended to manipulate into proving his point. It was a masterclass in forensic deception. He designed the perfect crime not to escape justice, to redefine it on his own terms. He thought he was a victim, I murmured, my voice low, and he wanted to make us all understand what it felt like to be misled, to be judged by fabricated evidence. The detective clapped me on the shoulder. Well, he certainly made his point, Blake, but you found him, you stopped him, and you put the pieces together. No matter how intricate his plan, it wasn't perfect enough. I looked out at the empty containment zone, the sterile environment suddenly feeling less alien, more like a blank canvas where a twisted masterpiece had almost been completed. The closure was palpable, a heavy weight lifting from my shoulders. The case, the baffling murder investigation that had consumed me, was finally, irrevocably solved. He had made his statement. Now we had to make ours. Had come to its true, undeniable end. The silence in the containment zone was a different kind of silence now. Not the oppressive, watchful quiet of an active investigation, but a hollow echo that spoke of absence, of a narrative concluded. The air, still filtered and circulated, felt lighter, less charged with the ghost of a meticulous deception. I ran a gloved hand along the smooth, cool surface of a diagnostics panel, the faint hum of dormant machinery the only sound. It was here, in this sterile box within the larger quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, that the killer had almost woven their masterpiece of misdirection. Almost. My mind replayed the initial days, the overwhelming data, each piece fitting together with such unnerving precision. It had been a trap, a meticulously constructed illusion designed to lead any forensic mind, especially one as prone to logical patterns as mine, down a predetermined path. The killer hadn't just murdered a victim. They had tried to murder the truth itself, burying it under an avalanche of perfectly curated lies. And I had almost fallen for it. I walked the perimeter of the zone one last time, my boots squeaking softly on the disinfected floor. The sealed entry hatch, the decontamination showers, the rows of empty equipment racks, they all seemed to mock the simplicity of the killer's final undoing. It wasn't some grand, overlooked chemical residue or a misplaced fiber. It was the human element, the flaw inherent in any attempt at absolute control. The killer's meticulousness, the very trait I often prided myself on, had become their Achilles heel. They had planned for every contingency, every scientific test, every logical deduction, except for the illogical, the gut feeling, the moment where I let go of what should be true and simply observed what was. The professional betrayals had been just as intricate, a subtle twisting of protocols, a manipulation of trust that had nearly crippled the investigation from within. It had made me question every interaction, every shared piece of data. My colleagues, the detective, even the junior analysts, I'd found myself scrutinizing them all, a bitter taste in my mouth. This case hadn't just been about finding a killer. It had been about dismantling a system of carefully placed decoys, not just of evidence, but of allegiance. And then there were the ghosts. The memories of my own past traumas, the ones that had shaped my precision, my detachment, my need for order. This killer's obsessive control, their desire to rewrite reality, had resonated with a part of me I rarely acknowledged. A part that, in its own way, craved a similar level of predictability. For a while, I had doubted myself, questioned if my judgment was clouded by this eerie kinship, if my own past was blinding me to the obvious. The struggle had been internal, a silent war waged alongside the external investigation. Could I trust my own instincts when they felt so intertwined with the very pathology I was trying to unravel? The answer, I now understood, lay in the distinction. My precision was for truth, theirs was for deception. My order was to reveal, theirs was to conceal. That was the crucial, almost spiritual difference. The true revelation wasn't a piece of evidence, but an understanding. The killer hadn't just wanted to frame someone else. They wanted to frame me, or at least frame my methodology. They wanted to prove that even the most rigorous forensic science could be outmaneuvered, that the truth was malleable in the hands of a sufficiently clever architect. The too perfect evidence was a challenge, a taunt aimed directly at the very foundation of my work. They had created a scenario so flawless, they believed it would force me to conclude a lie. That was their ultimate flaw. They underestimated the human capacity for pattern recognition beyond the obvious, the instinct that screams when something is too good. They had over-engineered their perfect crime, forgetting that perfection itself is often the most glaring anomaly in a world built on entropy. I took off my gloves, the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to my skin. The quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected now, felt less like a cage for a killer's ambition, and more like a crucible where my own understanding of justice had been forged anew. The closure was real, but it wasn't a clean, sterile seal. It was messy, human, and enduring. I hadn't just solved a case. I had confronted a part of myself, a ghost that had walked hand in hand with my professional identity for too long. Walking out through the final airlock, the heavy door hissing shut behind me, I felt a measure of peace, not absolute but hard-won. The world outside the facility, with its unpredictable variables and its chaotic truths, still waited. And I, Blake, with my renewed purpose and clearer understanding, was ready to face it. The complexities of justice were vast, I knew, stretching far beyond the confines of any lab or containment zone. But I also knew that somewhere within that complexity, the truth, however obscured, always left its mark, and I would always be there to find it.